I'm Kira Dawson, 32 years old, and I serve my country in ways I'll never be allowed to talk about. For 14 years, I kept my family safe by keeping them in the dark, letting them believe I washed out of basic training so my cover would hold. But when my own father stood up at his birthday barbecue and humiliated me in front of 30 relatives, calling me a quitter who couldn't last 3 weeks, I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Because what happened next said it for me. Have you ever been laughed at by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? If so, tell me your story in the comments. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from today. And if you've ever had to stay silent while someone who didn't know a thing about your life tried to define you, hit that like button and subscribe. What happened next might surprise you. My father drove a supply truck for the United States Army for 4 years. He came home with a bad knee, a specialist rank, and enough stories to fill every dinner table conversation for the rest of his life. To hear him tell it, he single-handedly kept the Cold War supply chain running from the cab of a 5-ton cargo vehicle. But to me, at 6 years old, standing in the hallway of our house in Clarksville, Tennessee, watching him hang his uniform in the closet for the last time he was the biggest man in the world, I used to sneak into that closet when he was at work. I would run my fingers along the fabric of his dress screens, trace the stitching on his name tape. Dawson. That was my name too. I thought that meant something. I thought if I touched the uniform enough times, some of what it carried would pass into me. The discipline, the toughness, the identity of a person who had done something that mattered. I was 6. I didn't know yet that my father's service, while honorable, had been ordinary. I didn't know the difference between a specialist who drove trucks and a colonel who commanded battalions overseas. To me, the uniform was the uniform, and my father wore it. That was enough for a girl who wanted nothing more than to be exactly like him. My mother, Linda, was the quiet center of the household. She kept the house running, the bills paid, the meals on the table, while my father kept the stories running. She never served, she never wanted to. But she understood what the Army meant to Dale Dawson. It wasn't just 4 years of his life. It was the thing that defined him, the thing that made him feel like he mattered in a world that didn't always notice men like him. And she let him have that, even when the stories got longer and the details got grander with each telling. She never corrected him. She just smiled and poured more coffee and let him be the hero of his own history. I think she loved him most for needing it so badly. My younger brother Kevin came along when I was 6, the same year my father came home from the Army. Kevin was the golden child from the moment he arrived. Loud, funny, athletic, effortlessly charming in a way I never was. He played football in the backyard while I sat in my father's auto repair shop, handing him wrenches and listening to him talk about convoys and motor pools and the time his platoon sergeant chewed him out for a crooked bumper number on a deuce and a half. Kevin didn't care about any of that. He would rather throw a spiral than hear about Fort Hood. But I cared. I cared about every word my father said, because every word was a blueprint for the person he wanted me to become. And I wanted to become that person more than I wanted anything else in my life. By the time I was 14, my father had stopped telling me Army stories for entertainment and started telling them with purpose. He would sit me down in the shop after school, grease on his hands, fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and talk about what the Army gives you that nothing else can. Structure, discipline, a backbone you can't buy at any store or learn from any book. He told me I had his spine. He said Kevin had his mother's, which wasn't an insult to my mother, just a fact in his mind. Kevin was soft, comfortable, built for the civilian world, and perfectly happy to stay in it. I was different. I was built for something harder. That's what he believed with absolute certainty. And because he believed it with every fiber of his being, I believed it too. I didn't question it. I absorbed it the way I absorbed everything he told me in that shop. He started leaving recruitment brochures on the kitchen table when I was 16. Not pushy about it, just casual, like they had blown in through an open window. The Marine Corps, the Army, the Navy. I would pick them up and read them at night in my room, studying the photos of women in uniform, wondering if I could be one of them someday. My father never told me I had to enlist. He never made it a direct ultimatum or sat me down for a serious conversation about it. He just made it clear in 100 small ways over 2 years that this was what he wanted for me, that this was the path that would make him proudest. And I wanted to want what he wanted. That is the trap of loving a proud man. You don't just want his approval. You want to earn it on his terms, using his measuring stick, walking his road, even if the road turns out to lead somewhere neither of you expected. I enlisted the week after high school graduation, June of 2012. My father drove me to the recruiting office in downtown Clarksville on a Tuesday morning. He wore a clean button-down shirt, which he never did on weekdays. He combed his hair. He even cleaned the grease from under his fingernails, which I had never seen him do for anything short of a funeral. He shook the recruiter's hand and said, "This is my daughter. She's ready." He walked me through that door like he was handing me off at a wedding, like the Army was the only future worth having, and he was personally delivering me to it. I remember looking back at him as I signed the papers. He was standing by the window with his arms crossed, chin lifted, smiling wider than I had seen him smile in years. I thought I was making him proud. I was right. But that pride had an expiration date neither of us saw coming. Basic combat training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I arrived in mid-June of that year with a bus full of recruits who looked as terrified as I felt. The South Carolina heat was suffocating. 100-degree days that turned the red sand into a skillet and soaked through your uniform before morning formation was even finished. But I was ready for it. I had spent 18 years listening to my father talk about the Army like it was a sacred institution, and I had converted fully. I wanted to earn what he had earned. I wanted to come home with my own stories, my own name tape, my own uniform hanging in a closet next to his. The first 2 weeks were everything I had expected and more. I was top of my platoon in the physical fitness test. I could outrun half the men on the distance runs and outperform most of them on the obstacle course. My drill sergeant, Sergeant First Class Moody, was a wiry man from Alabama with a voice like a belt sander and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not give compliments. That was not part of his vocabulary. But he stopped singling me out after the first week, which in his language was the highest praise any recruit could ever hope to receive. I was good at this. I was genuinely, undeniably good at this. And every night, lying in my bunk after lights out, listening to the breathing of 40 other recruits in the dark barracks, I thought about calling my father to tell him how well it was going. I wanted him to hear it directly from me before he heard it from anyone else. I wanted him to know that the spine he said he gave me, the one he had been talking about since I was 14 years old, sitting on a stool in his shop, was holding up just fine under real pressure. I never made that call, because in the middle of week 3, at 0200 on a Tuesday morning, everything I thought I knew about my life changed forever. And the story my father would tell about this moment, the one he would polish and perfect and repeat for the next 14 years, to anyone who would listen at any barbecue or family dinner or holiday gathering, would be completely and entirely wrong. Every single word of it. Sergeant First Class Moody shook my rack at 0200. I opened my eyes to his face, 6 inches from mine. Flashlight pointed at the floor so it wouldn't wake the rest of the bay. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a drill sergeant about to smoke a recruit. He looked like a man delivering news he had been told to deliver without asking questions. He said, "Dawson, get dressed. Report to battalion headquarters. Building 12, second floor, room 214. I asked if I was in trouble. He said no. But the way he said it, flat and careful and stripped of the usual edge, told me this wasn't routine. Moody had been screaming at us for 2 solid weeks. This was the first time I had heard him use his real voice. I got dressed in 4 minutes, boots, uniform, hair pinned up tight. I walked across the dark post alone. No escort, just me and the South Carolina night, cicadas screaming in the tree line, the barracks behind me glowing under sodium lights. Building 12 was administrative. I had never been inside it. I climbed the stairs and found room 214 at the end of a fluorescent-lit hallway. The door was closed. I knocked. 2 men were inside. No uniforms, civilian clothes, dark slacks, collared shirts tucked in, government lanyards tucked into breast pockets. They didn't stand when I entered. They didn't shake my hand or tell me their names. One of them, seated behind the desk, gestured to the chair across from him without saying a word. The other stood by the door with his arms folded, watching me the way you watch someone who doesn't know they're being evaluated. The seated one opened a manila folder with my name printed on the tab and started talking. He said my pre-enlistment screening results had flagged me for a program. The battery of tests I'd taken months earlier at the Clarksville recruiting office, the psychological resilience evaluation, the spatial reasoning assessment, the reaction time sequence, had placed me in the top fraction of a percent of all candidates screened that fiscal year. He said this calmly, the way a doctor reads lab results to a patient. No excitement, no congratulations, just data delivered in a flat and measured tone. He said the program was classified and he could not name it in this room or any other. He said I had been selected. He said my time at Fort Jackson was over, not because I had failed in any way, but because I had been identified for something else entirely, something that required a completely different pipeline than basic training could provide. I sat in that chair and felt the ground shift beneath me. I was 18 years old. 3 weeks earlier, I had been in my bedroom in Clarksville reading recruitment brochures. 2 weeks earlier, I had been doing push-ups in South Carolina sand until my arms gave out beneath me. And now 2 men in a room I didn't know existed were telling me I had been selected for a program they wouldn't name. I asked what it meant for me. The seated man said it meant I would be leaving Fort Jackson tonight. Processed out completely. Gone before morning formation. Gone before anyone in my platoon could ask where I went. Then he told me the part that changed everything. He said my drill sergeant would be informed that I had quit. Voluntarily withdrew from training, couldn't handle the pressure, and chose to walk away from the program. And my family would be told something different. They would be told that I had washed out. Failed to meet the physical and mental standards required to continue in basic combat training. I said that wasn't true. I said neither version was true. He said it was simpler that way. Cleaner. The program required a cover story, and this was the one that had been assigned to my particular case. The man by the door spoke for the first time since I had entered the room. His voice was quiet, precise, and completely without warmth. He said, "You're not in trouble, Dawson. You've been selected, but from this moment forward, your previous life at this post is over." I was processed out of Fort Jackson before the sun came up. By the time Sergeant First Class Moody called roll at morning formation and noted my absence with nothing more than a checkmark and a brief shake of his head, I was already in the back of a government sedan heading to a military airfield I had never heard of. Moody had been told I quit. I imagine he moved on without giving it another thought. Recruits wash out every single cycle. It happens. But I didn't quit. I have never quit anything in my entire life. And the fact that the United States government needed people to believe that I had was something I would carry silently for the next 14 years. I called home from a payphone at a transit facility somewhere in Virginia. I didn't know exactly where I was. They hadn't told me, and the windows of the sedan had been tinted dark enough that I couldn't track the route we had taken. My father picked up on the second ring. His voice was cheerful and expectant. He was waiting for good news from his soldier daughter. I tried to explain that I was being transferred, that something had changed, that it wasn't what it was going to sound like. But I didn't have the words. I didn't have the clearance. And my father didn't have the patience to listen to what he couldn't understand. He heard the words, "I'm leaving basic," and he filled in the rest himself. He said, "You washed out. 3 weeks. I drove you there myself, and you washed out." His voice wasn't loud. It was low and flat and disappointed in a way that went deeper than yelling ever could have gone. I said, "Dad, it's not like that." He said, "It's exactly like that." And then he hung up the phone. That phone call became the origin story of everything that followed in my family. By the time I arrived at the classified training facility, a compound in a location I am still not authorized to name, my father had already called Kevin. Kevin told his friends at school. My mother heard it from both of them before dinner was on the table. The story calcified overnight into something hard and permanent. Kira enlisted, lasted 3 weeks, washed out of basic training, came home with her tail between her legs. Except I didn't come home. Not for a very long time. And when I finally did, the story was already so deep in the family's bones that correcting it would have required a truth I was forbidden to speak. The classified program was called the Accelerated Selection Pipeline. 11 candidates from across the military's intake system, each pulled from their initial training the same way I had been pulled from mine. We were housed in a facility that didn't appear on any map. We ran until we vomited. We were sleep-deprived for days at a time. We were tested on pattern recognition, strategic reasoning, language acquisition under extreme stress, and composure in scenarios I am still not authorized to describe in any detail. The washout rate was brutal and designed to be. 6 candidates were gone by the end of the first month. 5 of us made it through to the end. I finished first in my cohort. Not because I was the strongest or the fastest, but because I was the most stubborn person in that facility. I refused to break. I refused to prove my father right. In early 2013, at 19 years old, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant through a direct commissioning program tied to the unit I would serve for the next 14 years of my career. The unit was called Phantom Cell. It was a compartmented direct action and intelligence element operating under Joint Special Operations Command. Its existence was classified at the highest level. Its personnel records were sealed behind walls that most senior officers would never see past. Its missions were conducted in countries that would officially deny our presence if anyone asked. When people back home asked me what I did for a living, I said I worked for the government. A desk job, administrative support. That was the cover, and I wore it like a second skin. But I never wore it long enough to forget who I really was. Because every time I walked through my parents' front door and saw my father in his recliner, ready to tell the boot camp story to whoever happened to be in the room, I was reminded that the person my family thought I was and the person I actually was had nothing in common except a last name. I was promoted to first lieutenant at 21, captain at 23. That was when I received my call sign. Phantom 8. It was assigned during my first operational command, leading a 6-person direct action team into a country I will never name, on a mission I will never describe in any detail. The call sign stuck. Within the corridors of JSOC, within the secure briefing rooms, and the classified communication channels, where people like me spent their professional lives, Phantom 8 meant something. It carried weight. When that call sign came across the net, people paid attention. Spines straightened. Conversations stopped. In my parents' kitchen in Clarksville, Tennessee, Kira Dawson meant something else entirely. A girl who couldn't hack 3 weeks of basic training. 2 different worlds, 2 different versions of the same woman, separated by a wall of classification that I could never take down. By 26, I had completed more deployments than I could count on both hands. I had been decorated in ceremonies attended by 4 or 5 people in windowless rooms with no cameras and no records that anyone outside those rooms would ever be allowed to access. I had saved lives and lost friends and carried the kind of weight that would have broken most people twice over. And every single holiday, every family gathering, every birthday and graduation and cookout, I drove home to Tennessee, put on jeans and a plain t-shirt, and sat at my father's table while he told the boot camp story to whoever happened to be within earshot. Kevin would laugh right on cue, the way he always did. My mother would study the tablecloth like there was something written on it that only she could read. And I would sit there with my hands folded in my lap, absorbing every single word, because the alternative was a truth I was not authorized to speak. When they pinned my major's oak leaves at 28, there were 4 people in the room. A 2-star general, Colonel Marsh, my commanding officer at Phantom Cell, and 2 members of the unit's command staff. No family, no photographs, no announcement, no record anyone outside that room would ever access. Colonel Marsh shook my hand and said, "You've earned this, Major Dawson." I thanked him. And that night, alone in my quarters, I sat on the edge of my bunk and thought about my father. I thought about the recruiting office, the clean shirt he wore, the handshake with the recruiter, the smile by the window. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now. Gold oak leaves on my shoulders, a call sign that made operators stand straighter when they heard it. 14 years of classified service he knew absolutely nothing about. I wondered if he would be proud, or if the story he had been telling was so deep in him by now that the truth itself wouldn't matter even if he heard it spoken out loud. I decided a long time ago that it didn't matter what he would think. I had stopped needing his approval somewhere around year 5, but I hadn't stopped wanting it. That's the thing nobody tells you about growing up with a proud father. You can outgrow the need for his approval and still carry the want around with you like a stone in your chest that never gets any lighter. It doesn't shrink, it doesn't dissolve, you just learn to breathe around it. Dale Dawson turned 60 in the summer of 2026. My mother planned a birthday barbecue at the family home, the same property I grew up on, the same gravel driveway I learned to ride a bicycle on, the same backyard and open field behind the house where Kevin and I used to chase lightning bugs on warm July evenings when we were kids. She invited everyone she could think of. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, guys from my father's auto repair shop, old friends from the neighborhood. 30-plus people in all. It was the biggest gathering the Dawson family had put together in years, and my mother had been planning it for weeks, making lists, calling relatives, ordering extra food from the wholesaler. I flew in the day before, rental car from Nashville, an hour south on the interstate through the green Tennessee hills. I pulled into the gravel driveway wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Nothing about me said military. Nothing about me said major or Phantom 8 or classified clearance or anything that mattered. I was just Kira, Dale's older kid, the quiet one, the one everyone knew had washed out of basic training 14 years ago. I found my mother at the front door. She hugged me the way she always did, hard and long, like she was checking I was still in one piece. She pulled back and looked me in the eyes and whispered, "He's in a mood today. Just let it go." I nodded. I always nodded when she told me that. The barbecue was in full swing by noon. My father was behind the grill in his element, apron tied around his waist, tongs in one hand, cold beer in the other, holding court the way he had been holding court at every family gathering for as long as any of us could remember. Kevin was right beside him, 26 years old and still performing for our father's approval like he was 12, matching his volume, matching his energy, laughing at his jokes before the punchlines even landed. I stayed on the margins where I was comfortable. I helped my mother carry out the potato salad and the baked beans. I poured sweet tea for my Aunt Carol and made small talk with cousins I only saw once a year at events like this. I was invisible, which was exactly where I wanted to be, where I had learned to be over 14 years of practice. It didn't last. My father spotted me across the yard around 1 p.m. He called my name in that big voice of his, the one that carried across every room and every backyard he had ever stood in. He waved me over to the grill with his tongs. I walked over because I always walked over when he called. He threw his arm around my shoulders and turned me toward the crowd like I was a prop in a show he had been rehearsing for 14 years. And then he launched into it. The story, the enlistment, the drive to the recruiting office, the handshake with the recruiter, and then the phone call 3 weeks later. He told it with the practiced rhythm of a man who had told it 100 times before and knew exactly where every pause and every headshake and every beat of laughter belonged. "She washed out," he said, laughing and shaking his head with a grin that was half pity and half performance. "Couldn't even make it through basic." Kevin was right on time with his line. 3 weeks, Dad. That's gotta be a record." Everyone erupted. 30 people laughing at the funniest joke my father had ever written. A joke he had been performing for 14 years, without once considering that the punchline was his own daughter. My mother looked at the ground. A cousin patted me on the back and said, "Don't worry, honey, not everyone's cut out for it." I stood in the center of that circle of laughter and said nothing. I had led operations in countries my father couldn't find on a map. I had a call sign that made colonels sit up straight in their chairs. And I was standing in my parents' backyard being called a washout by a man who drove supply trucks for 4 years and never made it past specialist. I didn't say any of that. I just stood there, still, controlled, absorbing impact without visible reaction. It's a skill they teach you in Phantom Cell, though they don't call it that. They call it composure under duress. I always just called it Sunday dinner. Then I heard it, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. A low thrum, distant but building fast. Rotors. I looked up before anyone else did. The tree line at the back edge of the property was starting to sway, not from any breeze but from downwash. The sound built the way it always builds when you have been around military aviation long enough to recognize it in your sleep. From a hum to a vibration you feel in your teeth and your ribs and the soles of your feet. The coffee cups on the folding table started rattling. Napkins lifted off plates and scattered across the grass. People looked around, confused, squinting toward the sky, not understanding what was happening. My father shielded his eyes with one hand and stared toward the tree line. A UH-60 Blackhawk cleared the tree line at low altitude, nose slightly down, and descended into the open field behind the house. The rotor wash hit the barbecue like a physical wall of wind, paper plates launched sideways off tables. The plastic tablecloth ripped free and wrapped itself around a lawn chair. Somebody's soda can toppled and rolled across the patio stones, and the birthday banner my mother had strung between 2 trees snapped one of its ties and flapped wildly in the turbulence. The helicopter settled onto the grass with a controlled shudder, flattening a perfect circle beneath its landing gear, kicking up a thick cloud of dust and cut clover that drifted across the yard like smoke from a brush fire. The engines stayed running. The rotors kept spinning at full speed. This was not a social call. This was not a wrong address. This was a pickup. My father took a step forward, his mouth open, his eyes wide above his shielding hand. He said, "What in the—" Kevin was beside him, frozen mid-bite into a hot dog, jaw slack. He said, "Is that a military helicopter in our yard?" 3 men stepped out of the Black Hawk before the dust had fully settled. Full tactical kit, helmets fitted with mounted optics, plate carriers loaded with magazine pouches, sidearms strapped to their thighs, boots that had been on real ground in real places that never made the evening news. They moved in formation, controlled and deliberate and unhurried, across the field toward the house. They didn't scan the crowd. They didn't look at my father. They didn't glance at Kevin or my mother or any of the 30-plus guests standing in the yard with their mouths hanging open and their plates sagging in their hands. They walked directly to me. The lead operator, a man I had worked with on 4 separate deployments across 3 different continents. A man I trusted with my life and who trusted me with his, Master Sergeant David Holt, stopped 3 feet in front of me on the patio. He came to attention with a precision that was automatic and absolute. His posture was rigid, practiced, exact. His right hand snapped to his brow in a salute so crisp it could have cut glass. And in a voice that carried across the entire silent yard, he said, "Ma'am, Phantom 8, it's time. Ghost protocol is active. We're wheels up in 3 minutes." The yard went silent. Not quiet, silent, the kind of silence that falls when 30 people simultaneously stop understanding the world they're standing in. My father's arm, the one that had been draped around my shoulders 10 minutes earlier, while he called me a washout in front of everyone he knew, dropped to his side. His face had changed completely. The performance was gone. The birthday grin was gone. In its place was something I had never once seen on Dale Dawson's face before in 32 years of being his daughter. Confusion. Real, unguarded, total confusion. I returned the salute. "Understood, Master Sergeant." I didn't explain. I didn't turn to my father and deliver the speech I had imagined giving 1,000 times in the shower, in the car, lying awake at 0300 in some bunk overseas. I didn't say any of the things I had rehearsed in my head for 14 years. I didn't need to. The salute said it. The tactical gear said it. The Black Hawk idling in the field with its engines running and its rotors cutting the Tennessee air, burning jet fuel at the rate of several hundred gallons per hour just to pick up 1 person from a birthday barbecue, said it louder and more clearly than any speech I could have given. I turned to my mother. She was standing at the edge of the patio, one hand pressed flat against her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes, her body absolutely still. I hugged her, quick, tight, the way you hug someone when you don't know when you're coming back or if you're coming back at all. I whispered in her ear, "I'll call when I can." She nodded against my shoulder. Her hand gripped my arm for half a second longer than it needed to, and then she let me go. She had always been the strong one in this family. She just never received any credit for it. I turned and walked across the yard, past the overturned lawn chairs and the scattered napkins and the birthday banner hanging crooked from its one remaining tie. Past the grill where my father's burgers were still sizzling on the grate, untended, starting to char and blacken at their edges. Past my brother Kevin, who stood on the porch steps with the expression of a man watching a building he thought was permanent collapse right in front of him. I walked across the grass and into the open field. Master Sergeant Holt fell in beside me at my left shoulder. The other 2 operators flanked us on either side. We moved across that field the way we had moved across dozens of landing zones in dozens of countries over the years. Fast, clean, purposeful. I climbed into the Black Hawk. The crew chief handed me a headset and I pulled it over my ears. I strapped in and cinched the harness tight across my chest. Through the small window, I could see my father. He was standing in the yard, maybe 40 feet from the helicopter, holding a burger spatula in his right hand. His left hand was hanging limp at his side. His mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. Behind him, the entire crowd was frozen. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, all standing in the dust and debris left by the rotor wash, staring at the woman they had been laughing at 3 minutes ago. The Black Hawk lifted off the grass. The nose dipped forward, and we cleared the tree line in seconds, climbing fast into the open sky. The house shrank beneath me, the yard, the field, the gravel driveway where my father had once driven me to the recruiting office, with the proudest smile I had ever seen on his face. I didn't wave. I didn't look back. I didn't owe my father an explanation. I never had. The helicopter was the explanation. I learned later what happened after I left. My mother told me, weeks afterward, in a phone call that lasted 2 full hours, the longest conversation the two of us had ever had. She said my father stood in that field for 40 minutes after the helicopter disappeared over the tree line. She counted. Not because she was timing him deliberately, but because she was watching from the kitchen window, and the clock was right there on the wall above the sink. 40 minutes. He didn't move. He didn't speak to anyone who approached him. He didn't put down the spatula he was still holding in his right hand. He just stood there in the flattened grass, staring at the empty sky where the Black Hawk had been, like he was waiting for it to come back and undo what had just happened to his understanding of his own daughter. Kevin tried to break the silence. He walked out to the field and said something. My mother wasn't sure exactly what, probably a joke, probably something about dramatic exits. My father didn't respond. He didn't look at Kevin. He just turned and walked past him toward the house, without a word, leaving Kevin standing alone in the trampled grass. The party was over. Everyone knew it. Guests started collecting their things, folding up lawn chairs, gathering coolers, carrying plates to the trash. Nobody said goodbye to my father because nobody could find him. He had gone to his bedroom and closed the door. My mother stood on the front porch and thanked people for coming, accepting hugs and bewildered handshakes, answering the same question over and over. What was that? What just happened? She said the same thing each time. I don't know exactly, but I think she's okay. Uncle Ray was the last to leave. Ray was my father's older brother, 63 years old, a retired Marine who had spent 20 years in the infantry before his knees gave out and the Corps let him go. He had seen things during his career that most civilians couldn't imagine. He didn't ask my mother what had happened because he already understood what he had watched unfold in that backyard. He recognized it immediately. An operational recall, conducted in broad daylight in front of 30 civilians with a full tactical team, for a woman his entire family had spent 14 years calling a failure. Before he climbed into his truck, he found Kevin at the edge of the driveway. Kevin was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, staring at the gravel. Ray put his hand on Kevin's shoulder and said, "That wasn't a ride home, son. That was an operational recall. Whatever your sister does for a living, it's not a desk job. You need to stop laughing at her." Kevin didn't answer. He just turned and walked inside the house. My mother said my father sat on the front porch that night for more than 2 hours after the last guest had left. She brought him a plate of leftover barbecue. He didn't touch it. She set a cold beer on the armrest of his chair. He didn't open it. He just sat there with his hands on his knees, staring at the tree line, while the cicadas screamed in the warm darkness and the last of the daylight bled out of the Tennessee sky. She said she had never seen him that quiet in their entire marriage. Not when his mother died. Not when the shop almost went under in 2014. Not ever. This was a different kind of quiet. This was the quiet of a man who was replaying every joke he had ever told about his daughter and hearing the laughter differently for the first time. I was already over the Atlantic by then. The mission brief was in my lap, printed on paper that would be burned before we landed. Colonel Marsh was on the secure channel, walking me through the operational parameters in the flat, precise shorthand we used when time was short and decisions needed to be made fast. A Phantom Cell asset had been compromised in a denied area. The extraction window was closing. They needed Phantom 8 on the ground within 18 hours. I didn't think about the barbecue. I didn't think about my father's face, or the spatula in his hand, or the laughter that had filled the yard. I thought about the mission because that's what 14 years of training had taught me to do. Compartmentalize, focus, execute. The feelings would come later. They always came later, usually at 0300 in a bunk somewhere, when the adrenaline had worn off and the quiet was too heavy to sleep through. But during the transit, somewhere over the dark water, I picked up the secure phone and called Colonel Marsh on a separate channel. Not about the mission. I said, "Colonel, my family may try to contact the base or reach the unit through other channels. If they do, don't confirm anything." He said, Understood, Major. Your cover holds. That was the entire conversation, even after everything. After the jokes, the laughter, the 14 years of being introduced at family gatherings as the daughter who couldn't make it through boot camp. I was still protecting them. That's what they never understood about me. The lies weren't for my benefit. They never had been. They were for theirs. The cover story existed to keep my family safe from the world I operated in, and I maintained it faithfully even when they used it to humiliate me. Because protecting people who don't know they need protecting is what I was trained to do. It's what I have always done. 2 days after the barbecue, my father drove to the recruiting office in downtown Clarksville. The same office, the same building, the same parking lot where he had parked 14 years earlier. He walked in and asked about his daughter. He said her name, Kira Dawson, and asked to see her service record. The recruiter behind the desk, a young staff sergeant who hadn't been born when my father served, typed the name into the system. He looked at the screen. He paused. He looked at the screen again. Then he closed it. He looked at my father and said, "Sir, I can't tell you anything about your daughter's service. That's above my clearance." My father knew what those words meant. He had spent 4 years in the Army. He wasn't Special Forces and he wasn't intelligence, but he understood the architecture of military secrecy well enough to know that when a staff sergeant at a recruiting office tells you a record is above his clearance, you are not dealing with a woman who washed out of basic training. You are dealing with something else entirely. He drove home in silence. My mother said he sat in his shop for 3 hours that afternoon, not working on anything, not answering the phone, just sitting in his chair, surrounded by his tools and his workbench and the Army photographs he had kept on the wall for 26 years. Him in BDS, standing next to a 5-ton truck at Fort Hood, grinning with the easy confidence of a young man who believed his service was the most important thing he would ever do. He looked at those photos differently that afternoon. The pride he had carried for decades hadn't disappeared. But it had shifted. For the first time in his life, Dale Dawson was considering the possibility that his daughter's service made his own look small. He called one of his old Army buddies that evening, a man named Garrett who had served with him in the Transportation Corps at Fort Hood back in the late 90s. They had stayed in touch the way veterans do: birthday calls, the occasional fishing trip, a shared vocabulary of Army slang that their civilian friends never quite understood. My father described what had happened at the barbecue. The helicopter, the 3 operators in tactical gear, the salute, the call sign. He told Garrett everything he had seen. Garrett went quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. Then he said, "Dale, a Black Hawk doesn't land in someone's backyard for a desk clerk. Your daughter is into something heavy." My father said, "I know that now." And then he said something he had never said before. Not once in 14 years. He said, "I think I've been wrong about her this whole time." My mother heard him say it from the kitchen doorway. She told me later that she had to put her hand on the counter to steady herself because it was the first true thing her husband had spoken about their daughter since the summer of 2012. Kevin took longer to come around. That was to be expected. Kevin had spent his entire adult life being the success story in the Dawson family, the athlete, the charmer, the finisher, the one who showed up and followed through. His identity was built on contrast. He was the winner because I was the washout. When the helicopter landed and that contrast evaporated in 3 minutes of rotor wash and salutes, Kevin didn't adjust. He dug in deeper. A week after the barbecue, he was at a bar in Clarksville with friends, telling them it was probably nothing, some government paperwork thing, an overreaction by some logistics office that sent a helicopter to the wrong address. "You know how the military is," he said. "Everything has to be dramatic." He needed the old story to be true because the new one made him feel small. I understood that about Kevin. I didn't hold it against him, but I didn't feel sorry for him either. My parents, meanwhile, began the slow and painful work of reckoning with 14 years of a story that wasn't true. They had conversations at the kitchen table late at night, after Kevin had gone to bed, that they should have had a decade earlier. My mother finally said what she had been holding inside for all those years. She told my father that the boot camp story had never once added up. Not from the very beginning. A girl who was top of her platoon in every physical fitness category doesn't wash out in week 3. A girl who could outrun half the men in her company doesn't get sent home because she failed to meet minimum standards. She said she had let it go all those years because his version was easier to live with, and because fighting him on it would have meant admitting that their daughter was living a life neither of them could see or touch or begin to understand. My father listened without interrupting, which my mother said was itself something she had never seen before. He said, "I should have known. I should have trusted her instead of my own disappointment." My mother looked at him across the table and said, "You should have, but you didn't. And now you have to sit with that." One evening, about 2 weeks after the barbecue, my father went to the hallway closet. The same closet where he had hung his army uniform when he came home from Fort Hood in the year 2000. The same closet where I used to sneak in as a little girl to run my fingers along his dress greens and trace the stitching on his name tape. The uniform was still there at the back, pushed behind winter coats, moth-eaten, faded, smelling of cedar chips and old wool. And behind the uniform, shoved against the far wall, was a cardboard box I don't think he even remembered putting there. Inside were my things. High school track trophies with my name engraved on small brass plates. An army recruitment poster I had pinned to my bedroom wall when I was 16. And a photograph of the two of us standing in front of the Clarksville recruiting office on the morning I enlisted. Me in a yellow sundress, him in his clean button-down shirt, both of us grinning at the camera like we knew exactly where the road ahead was going to lead. He held that photograph for a long time. My mother found him sitting on the hallway floor with the box in his lap and the photo in his hands. She said his eyes were red, but he wasn't crying anymore. He was past that by then. He was just sitting with the evidence of a daughter he had spent half her life refusing to see clearly. He pinned the photograph to his shop wall the next morning, right above the workbench, next to his own army photos. It was the first time my image had ever been displayed in that building. When a customer noticed it and asked who the girl in the sundress was, my father said, "That's my daughter." The customer said, "The one who washed out?" My father's jaw set. He said, Don't finish that sentence." That was the moment the old story died. Not with a confrontation or a grand revelation. It died in a greasy auto shop on a Tuesday afternoon when a 60-year-old man decided he would never tell his favorite joke again. He didn't know what the new story was, but he knew the old one was a lie. And for the first time in his life, Dale Dawson chose silence over performance. If you knew my father, you'd understand silence was the hardest thing in the world for him, and he chose it anyway. I was overseas when all of this happened, running an extraction in a country I cannot name. And somewhere in the back of my mind, sealed in the compartment I kept locked during operations, I was carrying a question I'd carried since I was 19. Does he know yet? Will he ever? I came home 3 weeks after the barbecue, flew into Nashville, picked up a rental car, drove south on the interstate I'd driven 100 times before. My mother hadn't told me much about my father's state of mind. She just said, "He's different, Kira. Come home and see for yourself." I pulled into the gravel driveway. The yard was clean. The folding tables were gone. The field behind the house was just a field again. The only thing that looked different was my father. He was on the front porch, but his posture was wrong. Leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a man in a waiting room. He stood when he saw me. Didn't wave, didn't call out in that big voice. Just stood there with his hands at his sides. I climbed the steps and we stood face to face. The performance was gone. The bravado was gone. What was left was just a man looking at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. He said, "I don't know what to say to you." I said, "You don't have to say anything, Dad." He said, "Yeah, I do. I just don't know how yet." My mother came through the screen door with 2 cups of coffee. The 3 of us sat down without another word. For the first time in 14 years, we sat together without the boot camp story hanging over us. After a long while, he said carefully, "Can you tell me anything? About what you do?" I said no. He nodded. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Can you at least tell me, are you safe?" I said, "Most of the time." He looked at the tree line where the Black Hawk had cleared 3 weeks earlier and said nothing for a long time. I asked about Kevin. My mother said he'd been distant since the barbecue. "Give him time. He's not used to being the one without the answers." We sat on that porch until the coffee went cold and the fireflies came out. It was almost entirely silence, but a different kind than I'd known in this house. The old silence was a wall. This one was a bridge. Months passed. My father went back to the shop. The boot camp story was gone, completely, permanently gone. When customers brought up the helicopter, he shut it down every time. I don't know what she does, and I'm not going to guess. Nobody asked twice. For a man who'd built his identity on being the loudest person in every room, choosing silence was a revolution. Kevin came around eventually, called me late one night, 2 months after the barbecue. Small talk at first, then, I don't get what you do, but I was wrong to laugh. It wasn't grand. It was a phone call at 11 at night from a guy who'd rather do anything than admit he was wrong. That's what made it matter. Then Colonel Marsh called me in. I'd been approved for a commendation, distinguished service, partially declassified. I could bring 2 guests, no cameras, no phones, NDAs required. But they could be there. 1 seat was easy. My mother had earned it every day for 14 years, so the second was the question. I lay on my bunk thinking about Dale Dawson, the man who drove me to the recruiter, who called me a washout for 14 years, who stopped telling the story, who pinned my photo to his wall, who asked if I was safe. I dialed his number. I said, "There's a ceremony, military. I can't tell you what it's for, but I'm allowed to bring 2 people. I'd like you to be one of them." A long silence. Then in a voice stripped of every layer of armor he'd ever worn, "I'll be there." I didn't invite him because he'd earned it. I invited him because I wanted him there. Maybe that's what forgiveness is. Not a decision, just a want that survives everything that should have killed it. My parents were escorted through 3 security checkpoints, signed NDAs, given badges with no names, just numbers. My mother held my father's arm the entire walk. His hand was trembling. The room was small, windowless. A 2-star general at the front, Colonel Marsh beside him. 8 phantom cell operators in the front row. I entered from a side door in full dress uniform, ribbons, insignia, gold oak leaves. The first time my father had ever seen me in uniform. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father just stared, face to collar to ribbons and back. He leaned toward my mother and whispered, "That's our girl." She whispered back, "That's always been our girl." The general read the citation. Parts were redacted, black bars across entire lines. But the words that came through were enough. Extraordinary valor under fire. Call sign Phantom 8. Personally responsible for the safe extraction of... And then a black bar. He pinned the medal to my chest. Everyone in the room saluted. I looked at my father, tears running down his face, quiet and steady. He was wearing a clean button-down, the same kind he'd worn to the recruiting office 14 years ago. Afterward, we stood alone in a hallway. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, he looked small. Not weak, just small. The way anyone looks when they realize the world is bigger than the story they told about it. He said, "I'm sorry. Not just for the barbecue, for every time, for 14 years. I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't, Dad." He said, "I should have trusted you." I said, "You're here now. That's what matters." He reached out and touched the ribbon on my medal, carefully, the way I used to touch his uniform in the hallway closet when I was 6. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I'm proud of you, Kira." 5 words, not loud, not performed, just my dad in a hallway. And it was everything. We drove home together, me in the back seat like I was 18 again. My mother reached her hand back and I held it for miles. My father caught my eye in the rearview mirror and smiled. A real smile. Weeks later, my mother called laughing. A customer had asked about me. My father smiled and said, "My daughter's in the Army, and that's all I can tell you." That became his only story. He told it the same way every time, with a pride that had nothing to do with details and everything to do with trust. I went home for Thanksgiving. My father was carving the turkey. Someone told a joke and the table laughed. He looked at me across the room, didn't say a word, just nodded. A small nod, the kind only I would catch. I nodded back. I spent 14 years being someone my family didn't know. I carried a call sign that made generals pause. I absorbed jokes that cut deeper than any wound I took in the field. But that evening, watching my father carve a turkey with the same hands that once drove me to a recruiting office, I wasn't Phantom 8. I wasn't a major. I was just Dale's daughter. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a family member mock you for something they didn't actually understand? What would you have done if a helicopter landed in the middle of the joke? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for being here. It means more than you know.